Sure. Good evening, everybody. I'm Norman Bay, class of '82, and currently I'm the head of the Energy Regulatory Group at the law firm Wilkie Farr and Gallagher, and before that was at FERC for about 8 years and served as the chair of FERC from 2015 through 2017.
Awesome. Thank you, Norman. So I guess we're going to start sort of talking about your path in education and in energy. So can you start just by telling us how did you find your way to Dartmouth when you were, many years ago when you were just arriving in Hanover for the first time?
Yeah, we probably each have our own story about how we ended up in Hanover. And my story is kind of simple, Kate. It was really by happenstance. I didn't have any family members or close friends who went to Dartmouth. And this is how long ago it was, during the holiday break in 1977, I had to pick up some forms at the school where I was in high school. And while I was at the school, which was otherwise deserted, I ran into the college counselor who, as it turns out, had gone to Dartmouth. And Mr. Reddington, and I thank him for doing this to this day, he said, "Norman, are you applying to Dartmouth?" And I said, "Well, I don't really think so, Mr. Reddington." He goes, "Well, you should apply." And so I applied and I got in, and it turned out just to be a great decision. But that's how I ended up in Hanover, Kate.
That's so funny. All of these random coincidences that end up having like really long lasting effects on our lives. So once you sort of made it, accidentally to Hanover, what was your life like when you were a student? What were you interested or involved in when you were on campus?
Yeah, so I was a history major, and I'm sure this is still true today, but Dartmouth, when I was there, had an amazing history department. And even for my freshman seminar, I took a seminar on the Armada, which was taught by Professor David Lagomarsino. And it was just an amazing class. And that just really hooked me on studying history. So yeah, very involved with the history department. I was a student representative to the history department. And then I did some other random things when I was at Dartmouth. I was in a chess club, and I played in the Pan American chess tournament one year. Really developed my foosball game. I have to say, while I was in Hanover, so I still have a pretty good wrist shot there. I also did a foreign study program. I did Art Renaissance in Florence, and that turned out to be one of the best classes I had when I was at Dartmouth. It really introduced me to the world of art, and so I developed an appreciation that I still have today.
Mm-hmm. That's really interesting. And we know not to challenge you to a game of chess or a foosball tournament. So we have a couple of folks from the class of 2020 joining us. And one of the goals of this whole series was to help students in a particularly challenging job market sort of navigate the postgraduate transition. I'm wondering, as you approached graduation, what was your mindset? What were you excited about? What were you concerned about? And what did you end up doing right after you graduated?
Well, I was pretty excited because I had applied to law school, in my senior year, and had gotten into Harvard. And so I decided to defer for a year. So I knew what I was going to be doing a year after leaving Dartmouth. And in that year off I had before law school, I planned a whole bunch of different things to do. Like, I was a paralegal for a law firm in New Mexico, which is my home state. It's where I grew up. And I was doing work on behalf of Indian tribes who had claims against the United States government for land that had been taken from them without fair compensation. So I did that, and then I spent some time actually as an intern at the Peggy Guggenheim Collection in Venice. And then I closed out my year by being a student teacher at Phillips Academy for their summer session. And then I started law school, and that was a lot less fun, at least for Harvard in those days.
So actually, just to back up a step, how did you decide that law school was something that you were interested in?
Yeah, great question. And there may be some students or recent graduates on the call tonight who are interested interested in law school or thinking about it. For me, I've always enjoyed reading, writing, and analytical thinking. So even though there weren't any lawyers in my family, instead people kind of went off into the sciences, I kind of became the first in my family to go to law school. But it was really because of the reading, writing, and the analytical thinking.
And so you are at law school for 3 years. At some point you graduate. And what was your sort of career path right after graduation? This was your last sort of formal education, right? So this is the point at which you start your sort of career trajectory. Am I correct?
Yes. Well, the first thing I did right after law school was to clerk for a judge on the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals who sat in Portland, Oregon. That's where his chambers were. So I did that for a year, and it turned out to be a great experience because it introduced me to the way in which judges think about cases when they're presented with issues.
And so what did you do sort of after that?
So after doing the clerkship, I wasn't quite ready to go to a law firm, which is something for most of my life I've been pretty good at not doing. And I decided I wanted to do public service, and I had the opportunity to be an attorney advisor in the Office of Legal Advisor at the State Department. And so I had the opportunity to do public international law. And I ended up doing that for about 2 years. And then I went to the Justice Department in Washington, D.C. I was with the U.S. Attorney's Office here in D.C. And I ended up staying in the Justice Department for about 11 years, going from D.C. To New Mexico, my home state, and eventually became the U.S. Attorney in New Mexico.
And were you looking specifically at any issues directly related to energy at that point, or were you what kind of law were you practicing? And then I guess my follow-up question to that is, how did you end up at FERC?
Yeah. So at the Justice Department, I was a prosecutor. So my focus was really on criminal law, maybe the law of evidence, some constitutional law on the criminal procedure side. But then I left the Justice Department after the election in 2000. So I left in the fall of 2001 and had the opportunity to become a law professor at the University of New Mexico Law School. And there, one of the classes I taught was administrative law. And a lot of energy law and policy is created by agencies through the administrative process. So that was kind of some of the background I had, although I wasn't an energy law professor. And in 2009, in early 2009, I got a call out of the blue asking if I might be interested in interviewing to become the head of the Office of Enforcement at FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. And I interviewed for the position and I got it. And I thought I would be at FERC for just maybe a year or two, and it ended up being more than an 8-year run with going from the position of director of the Office of Enforcement to becoming a commissioner and then the chair of the FERC.
And what was it like having, not had a great deal of explicit experience with energy to sort of jump into that? Do you feel like your experience with prosecution and administrative law just transferred easily, or was there sort of an onboarding process as you were learning the ins and outs of the sort of specialized area?
No, there's definitely a learning curve when it comes to federal energy law, and it's a pretty steep learning curve. But, in the Office of Enforcement, I was actually selected because I had an enforcement background as opposed to an energy background. Ideally, I think someone would have had both, but FERC in 2005, in the Energy Policy Act of 2005, was given a pretty powerful anti-manipulation tool. And FERC was rolling out the use of this authority, but I think the thought was that they wanted to bring someone in who really had a background in enforcement, so as to create priorities, enforcement priorities for the Office of Enforcement. And so that's why I got brought in. And so I didn't have to deal with the whole slew of energy law and policy. I had to deal with the policies most at issue in enforcement actions involving market manipulation claims.
So you were at FERC for 8 years and you left in 2017. And I guess, if you wanted to, you could talk about the reasons why you left. But my real question is, what have you been doing now? Like what is working at a private law firm that's sort of working in a similar space to what you were doing in the public sector? What has that been like to sort of look at a similar landscape from a different angle, I guess?
Yeah, it's been a great experience, and precisely because the reason you mentioned, Kate, it's because I am now practicing energy law from the perspective of outside counsel who is helping clients navigate this very complex area of the law. And so I've found that to be very rewarding and challenging. And certainly there have been times when I've thought to myself, gosh, if only I knew then what I know now about some area of FERC policy.
That's so funny.
Yeah.
All right. Well, that's sort of the batch of questions that I have about your sort of path from, before matriculation all the way to today. I have like 3 questions now that are about the impacts of COVID on your industry and, how that might be relevant for our students. And then we're going to move on to Q&A. So if you're a student on this call and you're just waiting for your chance to ask a question, it's not too far down the road. So Norman, the first question I have for you is, what has been the impact of COVID on your industry? And I guess you could take that in a number of directions, your like specifically legal practice, or if you wanted to, you could also talk about like the, regulatory arms of the government or other sort of federal energy departments and offices.
Sure. So short term, the power industry has seen a drop in load, in energy demand. Now that has begun picking up as offices and commercial and industrial places reopen. But if you were to compare this year from March on to last year, you'd see that overall there has been a decline in electricity usage. So that's maybe not a surprise. I think the more dramatic impact has been to the oil and gas industry. There was a period there in April in which there was actually negative pricing for the oil's futures contract here in the United States. And so that has never before happened. You had a pretty dramatic demand destruction coupled with an oversupply of oil. And so that led to these negative prices as storage facilities became completely full. There's like no place to put the oil, hence the negative pricing. And, the question I think for the oil and gas industry is, what does this mean long term? Is this just kind of a momentary blip caused by the pandemic, or does this herald some sort of more lasting change? And it's kind of interesting because the CEOs of Shell and BP, two of the largest oil companies in the world, have said that they think that peak oil demand may have happened. And both of those companies and perhaps this is not a surprise in light of the comments of their CEOs, have written off billions of dollars in assets over the last week or two. And so there is this question about whether longer term, the impact of this will mean a reshaping of the energy space with greater electrification and less usage of oil and gas.
Awesome. I mean, we just saw 2 pipelines in the past week or so have the stop put on them after, I mean, at least in the case of the ACP, 6 years of continuous fighting on the part of communities and activists to stop the construction of the pipeline. My next question is, for Dartmouth students who are looking to get into the federal government, public service, law, energy law, what possibilities do you see for jobs post-graduation or perhaps internships during an off term? Who's hiring, who's not hiring? What opportunities do you see in the space?
Well, first I would encourage all of the students and graduates who are listening tonight to consider a career in energy. And I say that because we're in the midst of this profound energy transition. And if we get it right, I think there are just incredible benefits, not the least of which is decarbonization of our economy, which is obviously needed to address climate change. And so I think if you do energy work, you can actually help change the world for the better. So I would encourage anyone who's interested in the energy space to really explore careers there. In terms of places where you might start to try to find a job, I have a few thoughts. One is, to look at USA Jobs, which is the website that the government runs to basically advertise job openings. So that's one thing that you can do. I know that my former agency, FERC, recently posted for some vacancies. The other thing to consider is to look for internships, because I think those can be a great way to figure out whether you'll enjoy doing a certain kind of work. And if you do, building up your network and connections to people at the place where you're working. So those would be 2 of the concrete pieces of advice I would give students and recent graduates, Kate.
Awesome, thank you. And I guess the next question is, in that sort of space or landscape, what are some challenges that are being experienced right now with the economic downturn, with like you talked sort of broadly about the impacts of COVID-19 on the energy industry, but I guess I'm wondering maybe a little bit zoomed in on your space. What sort of things should students have in mind as they're sort of applying for jobs and looking for jobs?
I would say that students should be patient in the sense that the economy right now is a mess, right? And there have been job losses in the oil and gas space, but also job losses in the renewable space. It's very hard for residential solar companies to talk to prospective customers and to install rooftop solar during this pandemic. So there has been this short-term impact even for the renewables industry. But longer term, I think things are much more positive, at least with respect to the renewables and clean tech spaces. So I would say just, be patient. If you can be. If you can't land a job, try to land an internship and then build out your network. So the piece of advice that no one gave me, years ago when I was leaving Dartmouth was the importance of building out your network. And Dartmouth alumni in particular, I think, are happy to be resources for students and recent graduates.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not so much the number of people in your network. So don't make the mistake of thinking that if I collect, 300 business cards or email addresses, that matters. What really matters is the quality of the network. And, there are books that are written about this, but some of the best advice I've heard is to make sure that whoever you're networking with understands that just as you hope someday they can help you, you're willing to help them too. That it's a relationship based on a certain amount of reciprocity. And so I think that's really good advice.
Yeah, that's really helpful. All right, so we've reached the end of me getting the chance to ask Norman questions, and we've reached the time at which I'm opening up the floor to you all. So if you have a question, just I guess unmute yourself and ask it. I would use the raise hand feature, but I feel like with the number of folks we have on this session, I don't think that'll be necessary. So have at it, folks. All right, Danielle, do you want to go ahead?
Hi, thank you. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about your time at the State Department in the Office of Legal Counsel there, kind of what that was like, and then what the transition was going from international law to more of the energy side of things. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Daniel. It was really a great honor to be at the State Department and the Office of Legal Advisor, because if you're interested in public international law, there's no finer place to be. I was actually assigned to a part of the Legal Advisor's Office called International Claims and Investment Disputes. The acronym is LCID, which is kind of cutesy, but that's what they call themselves. And, big picture, they do some work that's really interesting involving claims being litigated at international tribunals involving the United States. But the particular matters I ended up working on just involved a ton of paper, and were not, when you got down into the weeds, all that interesting. There are times when I've wondered whether I should have just kind of, stayed the course and been at State Department longer. But I had this amazing opportunity to go to the Justice Department, and I ended up taking that. But there's a big difference, obviously, between State Department and FERC. Not the least of which is that FERC is a domestic regulator with jurisdiction over the interstate natural gas and electricity markets. Very different missions, but similar in a sense that consistent with all public service. Your job is to promote the public interest. Your job is to do the right thing. And so while I haven't explicitly put in a plug for public service yet to all of you, I hope you'll consider it, whether it's right after college or right after grad school or at some other point in your career. I found it to be enormously rewarding. I've actually spent most of my career in public service after graduating from law school, and I don't regret it either. It's really been quite an honor. So consider it if you would. And I think that nowadays there are just so many challenges facing the United States that we're really going to need to recruit lots of really smart, dedicated, hardworking public servants to kind of address the many challenges that we have. And so I hope you'll consider public service.
Thank you, Norman. Does anyone else have a question to ask?
Yeah, this is Brendan Daly, class of 97 from Thayer School of Engineering, graduate school. I currently work for Public Service Enterprise Group, the largest utility in New Jersey. And the New Jersey Governor Phil Murphy just announced the big Windport project down in Salem, New Jersey. And I wanted to know what your thoughts were about the Windport project.
Yeah, is that one of the projects that PSEG is also helping to develop?
Well, it's going to be on north of our nuclear plant site. So we are involved from the standpoint of we currently own the footprint of land that will be developed on.
Mm-hmm.
And I've been involved a little bit on the periphery from some of the environmental impact related stuff on it. A PSEG will be involved, I guess you could say, on the periphery, at least right now.
Yeah. So, you know, I don't know enough about that specific project to comment on how that could impact PSEG. But clearly one of the major developments now in the Eastern energy markets has been offshore wind with New York, Massachusetts, New Jersey, Maryland, and Virginia, all committing to build, you know, double-digit gigawatts of wind energy. And so this is just a huge development and can really help all of those states meet their renewable portfolio standards. So overall, I mean, I think the development of offshore wind is very exciting, but I recognize that individual projects may have their own challenges. You know, I don't know, Brendan, whether you have a more specific question regarding that project or a more general question.
No, that was just a general question on what your thoughts were about it. It's relatively new. It was just announced, I think, 2 weeks ago. So it's pretty recent about the announcement.
Yeah.
Announcement.
No, I mean, overall, offshore wind is just an extraordinary development. But the costs are starting to decline fairly rapidly now. It's really been developed much more in Europe than it has been in the US, but a number of the offshore wind developers in Europe, Ørsted, Equinor, others, have begun to develop projects or plan projects in the United States. And oftentimes they're entering into joint ventures with US companies, including US utilities. And so that's also been very interesting to see. I think ultimately the benefits could be pretty significant given the capacity factor for offshore wind. The capacity factor tends to be higher for offshore wind than onshore wind in the sense that the wind blows more steadily offshore. The next development that could be really interesting to see is whether or not a cost-effective form of floating offshore wind can be developed. And there are a number of companies trying to do that, including a company that has a Dartmouth alumnus who's very, very involved in that effort, Dan Riker, who's also on the Irving Institute's advisory board. So that's going to be fun to watch, and we'll see what happens.
Thank you.
Awesome. Does someone else have a question to ask? All right, well, if you all don't, I'm actually going to take this opportunity to ask a question that I've been waiting to ask you, Norman.
Oh, so I think one hand went up, Kate.
Oh, oops.
Sorry, I threw my hand up a little late there.
Go ahead.
I was also late to this meeting, so I don't know what questions were asked previously, so I can just go watch the recording later if people already answered it. But I'm a 20, and I'm really interested in getting involved in the energy market. And what advice would you give to young students that are just entering and want to find footing somewhere or don't really know what direction they want to go in yet?
Right. So, you know, there are a lot of Dartmouth alumni in the energy space. And there's a fairly recent Dartmouth graduate who worked for me, and then he went to public policy school, and now he's with ACORP, which is a renewables trade association. His name's Tyler Stoff. And I don't think Tyler would mind that I'm mentioning his name. I would give him a call or send him an email saying, hey, Tyler, there was a program the other night, Norman was on it, and he said that you'd be willing to talk to me, and just see what Tyler says. But it doesn't have to be just Tyler. I would find out the names of other Dartmouth alumni who are doing energy work, and just send them a very polite email and ask if they'd be willing to talk to you and to kind of brainstorm with you. Because the thing is, it is so unfair that the class of 20 is having to go through this pandemic, right? And then the job market and all of that. And so people, I think, will want to be as helpful as they can. And even if you can't get a job, you can probably get an internship, whether it's with a government agency, whether it's with a nonprofit or an NGO, or whether it's with a trade association. It turns out that the head of the American Wind Energy Association is a Dartmouth grad, and he's also on the Irving board. And then the head of the Solar Energy Industry Association is a Dartmouth grad. I mean, so there are Dartmouth grad throughout the energy space, and ask them, do you have any suggestions for me? There is a client I have, a big renewables developer, and at some point I found out that the associate general counsel with whom I interact a fair amount was a Dartmouth grad, and so Dartmouth grads really are out there, and they want to be helpful, and I think they understand how hard it is for current students and recent graduates to deal with this job market. So I would say, see who you can contact and get ideas from. And then, with respect to jobs with federal agencies, go to USA Jobs and see what's posted there. There are energy companies that actually are looking to hire people, I think, and so you can probably, go to their web pages and see whether or not they're looking. Like, while Amazon is not an energy company, they have enormous energy needs, and so Microsoft, again, not an energy company, but enormous energy needs because of their data centers, and they've committed to going 100% carbon free. And so, so don't only think of classic energy companies when you do your search. And so that's kind of how I would think about it.
Awesome. That's really good advice. Thank you, Norman. I would also encourage you to check out, if you get the chance, there's a website that was created by the Irving Institute in collaboration with the Sustainability Office. That's the Energy and Society Careers website. It's esc.dartmouth.edu. Like the escape key on your computer, escape.dartmouth.edu. And you can check that out. And there's a lot of resources on there for like, I don't know where to start. I don't even know where to begin. So that might also be helpful. All right. Does anyone else have a question? If so, jump right in.
Norman, this is Brendan again. You talked a little bit about climate change. What, in your perspective, are the 4 or 5 things you think are needed to combat climate change?
So that's a great question. I think the overarching theme for me is electrification, that you continue to decarbonize the energy space, the production of electricity, and then you leverage that through the rest of the economy. So presently in the United States, more carbon emissions come from the transportation space than the power industry. And the last time that happened was in the late 1970s. And, you know, the Obama administration issued something known as the Clean Power Plan, which was supposed to achieve a 32% reduction in carbon emissions from 2005 levels by 2030. I will tell you that when I was at FERC, when I was the chair of FERC in 2015, we did technical conferences around the country to get feedback from stakeholders on what they thought about this goal of the Clean Power Plan. And there were more than a few witnesses at these technical conferences who said that meeting the goals of the Clean Power Plan were impossible. That, you know, there was one speaker who said, look, it can't be done by 2030. So he said, what about 2035? Not possible, he said. What about 2040? Not possible. What about 2045? Not possible. And then he said, it's never going to be possible. And okay, so it turns out that litigation has stopped the Clean Power Plan from ever being implemented, right? It has never gone into effect. Just recently, like a few months ago, the Energy Information Administration of DOE issued a report that showed that the national goal of achieving a 32% reduction in carbon emissions from 2005 levels was met in 2019. Okay, that's how dramatic this energy transition has been. And why? Because you've got cheap natural gas displacing coal plants, which are retiring and which are basically on their way out in the fuel mix. And then you've got a lot of renewables, right? And then the nuclear fleet, while it has been challenged, continues to produce about 20%, 19-20% of electricity in the United States. And so as more renewables are being added to the grid, and as more coal is retiring, you're going to see even more dramatic reductions in the carbon emissions from the power industry. So then what you have to do is start to leverage that decarbonization through other parts of the economy, whether it's surface transportation, space heating, and some commercial and industrial processes. And even using existing technologies, you can get to a very high integration of renewables. I would, you know, it has been actually in parts of the United States and some of the independent system operator electricity markets, regional electricity markets, about 75 to 78% of the grid's energy needs have been met at any point in time by renewables. That's how high the integration has reached. So this can be done. I think it is more challenging as you get to, you know, the 80% level, 90% level renewables, but it is still doable. And so I would say electrification, Brendan, would be super helpful. And then I think developing cost-effective energy storage would be very, very helpful. Certainly there's been a lot of discussion recently about the hydrogen economy and creating hydrogen through electrolysis with the electricity being produced by renewables, right? So that may be something to explore longer term. But I would say that electrification would be the key, and policies that promote electrification, whether it's, you know, increased transmission development, whether it's integrating more renewables, whether it's using battery storage, distributed energy resources, all of that can be helpful.
Yeah, that lines up pretty well with our strategy with Ralph Izzo's 5 things to combat climate change. And then the last one is something everybody can do, which is energy efficiency.
Sure.
And it's pretty much free, so to say. Changing an old incandescent light bulb to an LED, maybe bumping up your thermostat a bit on a summer day and lowering it on a winter day. So I was just kind of curious on what your perspective was and how well it lined up lines up with PSEGs. Thank you.
Well, I agree completely on the energy efficiency point. Even in changing from an Edison bulb to an LED, the energy savings is dramatic. And lighting accounts for low double digits an amount of electricity in the United States. So moving to more efficient lighting can really reduce that load. But you know, in energy efficiency, there have been advances now in demand response, right? Where people adjust their electricity usage at peak times on the grid by perhaps, you know, running their air conditioner at a higher temperature setting than they otherwise might. But digitalization is really enabling some pretty amazing DR possibilities where, you know, you can basically aggregate demand reductions across thousands of smart thermostats, right? And really achieve some pretty significant efficiency gains.
Thank you.
Are there other questions that folks have?
Do you think that institutions like Dartmouth has a responsibility to make these really progressive actions?
So I think, you know, all people and institutions have a responsibility to do their part in addressing climate change. And, you know, Dartmouth, I think, does some very important and helpful work in educating the next generation of leaders. And, you know, there are just so many smart, you know, talented, idealistic people at Dartmouth, students at Dartmouth. And you can get a great education there, and then you can use that education at some point in your job. And then, you know, if you become a leader of an organization. So I think in that sense, I think a liberal arts education and just making people aware of the problems and the complexity of these problems and the need to find solutions, I think in and of itself is very helpful.
Something else to check out for folks who are interested in Dartmouth's on-campus energy system, energy goals, energy progress, and I'm going to put this in the chat, is the Sustainability Office has an energy dashboard on their website where they show the greenhouse gas emissions, carbon intensity, and sort of a lot of broken down information about our campus energy consumption. A lot of people don't know this, but in the past 10 years, Dartmouth has invested actually a lot of money in energy efficiency, in retrofitting old buildings, in replacing less efficient buildings with more efficient buildings. And while increasing our campus square footage significantly, we've actually reduced our total greenhouse gas emissions. And that's really all from that efficiency work. We haven't really added a ton of renewable technology into our system, but we really have been investing in efficiency. And right now, the Dartmouth Green Energy Project is working on how they're gonna do something more radical to achieve our goal of 50% renewable energy by 2025, I think it is, by reducing our CO2 emissions by 50% by 2025 from a 2005 baseline. So folks should check that out if they're interested in that work. And I'm also happy to connect you all with the folks who are on the front lines doing that. But Dartmouth made some really aggressive and energy and sustainability overall goals in the 2017 Our Green Future report, which you can also find a link to. I guess I'll put it in the chat. But check out what Dartmouth is doing in this regard, because there is actually some cool work that's being done. And if you're a current student and not a recent alum or a not recent alum, you can get involved in that as well.
And I have to say, I'm very excited by the work of the Irving Institute. I think it provides opportunities to students in the energy space, from classwork to trips to study programs and like that are just amazing. I mean, there was no equivalent when I was at Dartmouth, a zillion years ago. And so I do think that provides additional opportunities for students to determine whether or not they have this passion for energy work. And then I think one goal of the Irving Institute is to provide leads to students on internships as well as other kinds of employment. And so this is something that's being developed, as well as the alumni network, which obviously, we would want students to be able to access.
Awesome. Are there any other questions that folks would like to ask? We're getting down to the point where we only have time for a few more. So if you have them, ask them. All right, Norman, I'll ask you a question. I've been waiting to ask this for a little while. You have been in the position at multiple times in your career of having a leadership role when you were the U.S. Attorney in New Mexico and when you were the chair of FERC come to mind. I'm wondering if you have any lessons in leadership that you'd like to share with students.
So a few things, Kate. First, I think everyone has the potential to be a leader, that there isn't one kind of model for leadership. And studies have shown actually that while the classic model for leaders in the West has been the extrovert, that introverts actually have significant strengths that they can bring to a leadership position. So don't be daunted by some perception of what you think leaders must be or how they must project themselves. So that's one thing. The other thing I would say is that it's really important to have this bedrock commitment to doing the right thing. And if that's your lodestar, people can tell in a heartbeat what you care about, right? And what you're trying to do as the leader of an organization. Another thing I would say is that as a leader, it's not about you. It's about the people you serve. It's about the people you work with. It's about the mission of your organization. I think too often people think that when they become a leader, that it's about them, as opposed to it being about everybody else. Mm-hmm. And that's another thing. I mean, the people you work with can tell in a heartbeat whether you think it's about yourself or whether you think it's about them and the public interest. So I would say all of those things matter. One thing that you see time and again in Washington, D.C., and so this is not a good thing when I mention this, is that people will ask the wrong question when they're dealing with a difficult issue. And when I say wrong question, the question too often becomes, what's the political thing to do, right? And instead, if you're really looking to try to solve an issue, the question should be, what's the right thing to do? Mm-hmm. And then you can ask as a follow-up question, politically, what can I get done? What's achievable? But if you start the other way around and you say, what's the political thing to do? You'll never get to the right answer. Or if you do, it's going to be completely by accident. So that would be some other advice I would give students and graduates.
Awesome. Thank you. We have time for probably 2 more questions.
I have a quick question. Hi, I'm Paridi. I'm a 23 at Dartmouth. And I was just wondering, I know that you moved from being the U.S. Attorney for New Mexico into FERC afterward, and then you were kind of, taken on board for your particular experience. But I'm wondering what kept you in the energy space for so long and why you're still there.
That's a great question. And because, when I went to FERC, I never really thought I would be there for that long. But it turns out that the energy space is just incredibly interesting. And we're going through this period of dramatic change, right? The energy transition is what most people call it. And it's a transition that we have to get right. I mean, if we are to address climate change, we have got to decarbonize the energy space and then decarbonize the rest of the economy. And so I have found that that doing energy work not only interests me intellectually, but it's an area where I feel like we can each make a difference. And I'm sure for Brendan, for example, at PSEG, he feels the same way, and that matters. So I mean, they say that the 2 most important things for people in terms of how happy they are with their jobs is first doing something that they think matters. So that's one. And the second is being appreciated for what they do. But I think in the energy space, you can clearly find both. You can find that kind of satisfaction.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
All right, it looks like we have time for just 1 more question, and then I'll close us out. So whoever gets to the mic first is gonna be the last one to ask a question for this session. No one? Norman, you covered everything so well that people don't have any other questions to ask you.
Yeah. Either that or I put them to sleep, Kate, so.
Well, I'm trying to give you the benefit of the doubt here. All right, well, I'll quickly, I'll shut us down, and at the end, Norman, I'll give you a chance to make any closing remarks that you might want to make. So thank you everyone for joining us tonight and for sticking with it until the end. I just want to make a quick plug for our other Alumni Sparks sessions this summer. Obviously here we had Norman tonight. Yay, you came to this. In the future, we have David Yeh, who works for a venture capital firm, who's also obviously in the energy space. You can read a lot more information about David here. Marcy Reed is joining us on July 22nd. Wendy Hato and Kate Bowman on July 29th and August 5th. We don't have quite as much information here, but you can check them out on LinkedIn if you like. In any case, I encourage everyone who came tonight and enjoyed the session to think about coming to other sessions in the future. Each one is really different, and a lot of people have found attending multiple sessions to be useful. Additionally, if you want to check out some of the past sessions from the spring, we have recordings of them here. This is Abby Hopper, who is the CEO of the Solar Energy Industries Association. That's who Norman was talking about earlier. And we have Tom Kiernan here, who's the American Wind Energy Association head. We have other great folks here too. So anyway, Norman, if you'd like to make any if you have any closing thoughts to share, here's your opportunity to do so. And then I'll finally let you get back to your life.
Okay. You know, I would encourage everyone on the call to think about a career in energy. I really think that it's an incredibly exciting time to be working on energy issues as we go through this dramatic energy transition. And so I think that there will be a lot of opportunities, and it's a transition that we have to get right, because if we can't figure out energy, I don't think we have a chance in addressing climate change. And I should also add that, you know, the challenge is really twofold, because on the one hand, we have to decarbonize the energy space. And on the other hand, there still are almost 1 billion people in the world who don't have reliable access to energy, to electricity. And so it's a really profound challenge, and it's one that we've got to get right. So, you know, if you like working on really difficult problems, but problems where you can make a difference, I think the energy space is a great place to be.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Norman. And thank you everyone for joining. Be in contact with me if you have any follow-up questions, or if you'd like to connect with Norman. And we wish you all a great evening. And goodbye.